Hi everyone, thank you for joining us this evening and welcome to this South Asian Heritage Month discussion on Leena Dhingra's new book, Exhumation, The Life and Death of Madan Lal Dhingra. My name is Tia Diabai and I am the museum lead for South Asian Heritage Month, and I'll be starting the event with a brief introduction to our speakers. But first, for those of you who aren't familiar with South Asian Heritage Month, the month runs from the 18th of July to the 17th of August every year, and it exists to celebrate and commemorate British South Asian histories and identities, both past and present. This event will be recorded and uploaded to our YouTube channel to watch at your convenience. So, as I said, we're joined together today for a discussion on Exhumation, the life and death of Madan Lal Dhingra. Exhumation tells the remarkable story of Leena's great uncle, the Indian freedom fighter Madan Lal Dhingra, who was executed in Pentonville Prison in 1909 for the assassination of a high-ranking British government official. Part history, part memoir, Exhumation is also the story of Leena's journey to come to terms with this painful episode from her family's past. It's published tomorrow by HopeRoad Publishing and will be available in UK bookshops and all the usual online channels, including bookshop.org. So, of course, we're here today with Leena Dhingra. She was born in India. Leena and her family were forced into exile in France in 1947 after the partition placed their home city of Lahore in Pakistan. An author and actor, her TV credits include The Bill, Casualty, Prime Suspect, and Doctor Who. She has also starred in EastEnders and Coronation Street. She's also starred in EastEnders and Coronation Street, and most recently appeared in the Channel 4 drama Ackley Bridge. Her first book, a novel, Amrit Vela, was published in 1988. And we are also joined here by Kishwar Desai, a writer and columnist. Kishwar's debut novel, Witness the Night, won the Costa Award for First Novel in 2010. As well as being a writer, Kishwar has worked for over 20 years as a journalist, TV anchor, and TV producer. She divides her time between India and London. Okay, so over to you both.
Thank you, Tia. That was wonderful introduction, and we are delighted to be here on South Asian History Month. Leena and I don't actually know each other. We just got introduced because of this book. But the wonderful thing is that both of us have been working in very similar areas because of our interest in the hidden histories of South Asia. And in Leena's work, the recent book which she's written on her uncle, we get to see this very much close up. And what is very intriguing about this book is that it is a biography, but it is also an autobiography. It talks about Leena's own personal journey in discovering this revolutionary and somebody who actually took the first shot, many would say, at dismantling the British Empire. He's a very interesting person himself, died extremely young, was executed. But at this moment, when Leena is with us, the first question that I really want to ask her is what made her write this book? Because it's not, I mean, obviously she knew about her uncle for a long time, but he has also been forgotten by many. So we will come to that as well, why this book is an actual exhumation. I love the title. I think the title is extremely apt because it is a literal as well as literary exhumation of someone whom the world had forgotten till she decided to write this book on him. So, Leena, congratulations. The book is going to be launched tomorrow. And as you know, I really enjoyed reading it because of my work on the Partition Museum, which is based, the present one is based in Amritsar. We have actually a sculpture of Madan Lal Dhingra right outside our museum gates. So it is somebody whom we in some way have been associated with for a long time. But for you, what was it to choose this particular moment to write this book?
Well, actually, it's been a long journey. And I remember reading that to write something, you've got to be haunted by something. And I was haunted by this. I first heard about it when I was in boarding school in England. And my sister came to me and she said, have you ever heard about Madan Lal Dhingra? And I said, no, who is he? She said, he was Daddy's uncle. And I've just read about him in a series called Famous Murderers. And I thought, gosh, I mean, what do you think when you're 12 years old and somebody's a murderer? Then the next year, I was in school in India. And somebody connected the name and said, are you any relation to Madan Lal Dhingra? So I didn't quite know what that meant. And I said, well, he was my father's uncle, but I don't know anything about him. And she said, well, if Madan Lal Dhingra was your father's uncle, then you come from the family of a great patriot. And then she went into sing how he must be honored and never forgotten, how she'd heard about him from her grandfather, and how when I grew up, you must find out about him. You know, and you'll have to go to London for that. I mean, we were dislocated in Paris. London was nowhere there. But it stayed with me. And over the years, something would happen and somebody would connect the name. Usually they'd have to be Bengali or Punjabi or from, you know, Bombay area, because they were the people who were in the forefront and they were the ones who knew. And they would say, oh, Madan Lal Dhingra, but I still knew nothing about him. And then finally, it so happened that, and this in a way I trace in the book, that journey. It was a time of the emergency, and I had joined a big front of the Indian Workers Association and many, many other groups who were agitating against the emergency. And at one of these meetings, somebody came and said, are you any relation to Madan Lal Dhingra? Great patriot, great martyr. And exactly the same words as my 13-year-old friend had done all those years ago. And again, you know, I felt then embarrassed that I knew nothing. And there were many reasons why I knew nothing, because I didn't know anything about. My family got dislocated when I was 5 years old in Paris. And India and what I was and this belonging was kind of like, it was a story that was difficult to tell or wasn't told. So I had my story, which wasn't told. And then there was a story in the past, which wasn't told. And yet I never quite knew whether I was allowed to find out these stories. So it's been a long journey, and it's also been a journey to get through all those layers where you censor yourself. You know, I'm growing up in Paris. I speak French. I come to school in England. I go to school in India. And then I have family in India. India's home. It's where you belong. India is a place where we don't have a home. You know, Paris is where my father is, but I have a visa to go to Paris. So it's all very complicated. Who, you know, you lose your, you know, your voice or your sense of things or identity come from belonging somewhere, to a family, to a place, to a house, to a home, to a country. And I never had that. And my book starts with something my sister said. And she said, when a trauma is undigested, it gets repeated. Partition was a terrible trauma, and nobody ever talked about it. And it got repeated again and again in Daddy's life, in Mommy's life, in my life, in your life. We never had a country, a home, a family, a home, a room of our own. You know, it's kind of like strange, you know, you read people who write about their childhood and memories of all these sort of quiet things. So just as much Madan Lal was a mystery, and my story was a bit of a mystery. And so I sort of very slowly started. And I've been at it and putting it away and vaguely attempting it for many, many years. I can't believe it's finally out.
So what was the moment in which, as I said, I mean, when you decided, now I am going to finish this book? It has been long enough. It has been somewhat, as Partition has been a festering wound for many of us. In the same way, it seems that you were troubled with this, not being able to finish Madan Lal's story.
Well, I finished it, a version of it, within an academic structure at the University of East Anglia as part of a PhD thesis. And I was able to do this because I had some funding. But it wasn't quite the book that I was ready to put out because you have time constraints. And then it just stayed there. I tried to put it out, but it didn't happen. It just stayed there. And gradually it became a bit of a weight. And I thought maybe I felt very confused and very guilty that I couldn't do anything, but going back to the book felt a bit traumatic. Then, as an actress, I was offered a part in Doctor Who to play this 90-year-old Pakistani woman who's got a secret story that she doesn't want to talk about. And that story is about the partition. And it was a very thoughtful script and a very healing script. And what I didn't expect was, I mean, I just had one part at the beginning and at the end, it was my story or the character's story, but the character was only there at the beginning, at the end. So I didn't know how the whole thing was. But when I watched it, I realized that partition as being so close to me that, if people ever would ask me, where do you come from? I would say, well, actually, I come from Lahore, but I've never been to Lahore. It's a part of India. I didn't like to answer that question. Suddenly, I realized that I had taken on that story as being entirely mine, but it was actually my mother's story, which I'd inherited through her stories. And out of love and loyalty to my mother, I had made it mine. She was not the kind of person who cried about and said, oh, things like that. But that whole life, when she would talk about this homeland, it was always the time that she'd lived there. And when she'd lived there, it was Lahore. And the people she talked about were from Lahore. And I'd never even been there. Then I read this thing, or I heard on the radio something which said, exiles wander in the world carrying in their heads a picture of a perfect universe. And I realized that I wasn't really an exile because I didn't have any picture of a perfect universe, even not a world that I knew. But when I watched this on the screen, a distancing took place. And I sort of realized that the story was there, it had happened, it was part of who I was, but it wasn't the only part of who I was. And when my mother died and I was asking her, is there any unfinished business? And for me, the unfinished business was always something from the stories, and she said, yes, there is. So I took a notebook and I said, what is it, Mama? And she said, I want you to be happy. And then I suddenly thought, I felt this lifting. And I'd started writing about her because my Aunt Romila had suggested after she died that I should write about her, that I'd find it meaningful. And she'd also encouraged me to write this family history. So I'd started that, and then suddenly it was always a little bit stiff, what I was doing. And then I suddenly realized, but of course, I have to go back to that manuscript about Madan Lal. I have to revisit it. And the whole image that you have in Doctor Who of time traveling, I said, that's what I'll do. I will time travel through the original manuscript, chuck out the bits that don't absolutely belong. And that's what I did. And as it happened, everything fell into place. I found an editor who was, very connected and warm towards it. And he kind of like saw the scope of it, and that enabled me and helped me on the journey. So there we are. Now it's there.
Wonderful. I think it's extremely fascinating because this is a book which is obviously really close to you. And through it, you have discovered yourself, your identity. Perhaps a glimpse of that happiness will be now within you that your mother wanted so much for you.
Mm-hmm.
Before we move on to more details about the book, I just want to talk a little bit more about your own background and your mother particularly, and the whole issue of partition, because you've mentioned many things. And I think for many of our viewers, it may be a little confusing because you have led a life which is a lot of time travel in it, perhaps, already. And so we want to know, with no puns intended, who are you really? So we are talking to someone whose family, correct me if I'm wrong, whose family, because of partition, could not go back for a long time because your father was already in Paris when partition took place. He was there on work, and so your mother, who was with him, and all of you just got trapped in a hotel room in Paris. And after that, you couldn't go back for a long time, and then you came to study in England and so on. Now, this story, which you say was so strongly, many parts of the book, very strongly inspired by your mother, who seems, I really wish I had met her. She seems like an amazingly, her character comes through so beautifully in the book. You said that her last words were, are you going to take me to Lahore? And
it was shocking, yes.
Yeah, for you, that was really amazing because somebody who her entire life had been almost like a refugee, perhaps herself. She felt herself to be a refugee her entire life, and her home was in Lahore. Was this something that you were also impacted by, as you said, that not this this ruthlessness which was there in your early childhood, and then of course what was impacting you from your mother as well, that comes through in the book. But was it something that you found was just embedded in your subconscious, or did you ever discuss this with her, this sense of not belonging, really?
I think it just got really embedded in my consciousness. It became who I was. It became my kind of identity almost, and I looked after my mother. And what happened was that 18 days before 18 days before she died, but that was like when some very, very old and very dear family friends from India had arrived. And Geeta Sarabhai and her daughter, and they'd come. And Geeta said to her, Kamla, you mustn't think that you haven't got any family left in India because her elder sister had died. You're our sister too. And you always got a home in Ahmedabad. Come back. If you want to come, come. And then she said to me afterwards, I don't know if she understood it all, but she did understand something. And it was like as if she understood that she could. Then the next day, Geeta left, and she suddenly said, are you taking me back to Lahore? Lahore meant India in a way. Lahore meant home. She didn't remember partition and all that at all. And it was kind of like a huge release because in the next 18 days, she just faded out. And she couldn't, she literally faded out, smiling away, She couldn't eat and she couldn't drink, but every day there'd be lunch prepared. People would come and visit, and she'd sit there with her mala and count the beads. And the doctor asked her when she couldn't swallow, do you think you're dying? And she said,
My God.
and she said, how do you feel about it? And she put down her mala and she said,
Amazing.
and because she always had that kind of awareness that, she used to sort of say that, you're born, and I have that coming in as sort of voices in my head. You're born and then you die, and life goes on. Death is the opposite of birth, not of life. So that kind of, and I would say, how do you know this? Do you know this from your experience or from your conditioning? And she would say both.
Mm-hmm. Well, perhaps it gave her a resilience to face the world as truthfully as she could, in many ways, because she did have a hard life. But I have to say this, Leena, you're probably one of the very, very well connected people from India. If you were to go back to India, you would probably know. Romila Thapar, the Sarabhais, your own mother was extremely well connected.
But
So
in Paris, yeah.
Sorry?
But in a way, we were also completely déclassés.
Yeah.
You see what I mean? Because we were refugees living in Paris in a one-room flat, where by the time I was 17, I had my father in Paris, my sister in South America, and my mother spending her time traveling between Paris, South America, India, London. And there was never any kind of stability. Where do you belong? Which country do you belong to? I'm part French, and when I'm in France, I'm sort of speaking in French, and then I'm in England, and it wasn't always easy.
Right. So I think I have a hypothesis that probably the ghost of Madan Lal Dhingra kept you in the UK. Otherwise, were you to go to India, you would be part of this very well-connected elite. However, here, because you were already living in this country,
Nobody, yeah.
You felt like a nobody, but actually you had this extremely valuable lineage. Very few people have this. To be connected to somebody who has given an enormous sacrifice for his country. Whether we believe that violence is a good thing or a bad thing when it is connected to revolutionary activity, that can be a personal belief. But at that time, people had very few options. And he was living in England at that time, came as a student. Now, to research his life, what were the difficulties that you faced? Because he has almost been erased from most history books, whether it is England, whether it is the UK, or whether it is India. As you said, probably in some book he might surface as a murderer or something. And of course, every year we will have some anniversary celebration or commemoration in India, but then we will forget all about him. So researching his life story must have been extremely difficult because, from what I gather in your book, the name Dhingra was removed from the elders in your family because they did not want to be associated with someone who was anti-British. It's a very ironical situation, and you have exhumed him back to his real self, and that could only happen because you're here in London, I think.
Maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's quite a lot of bits and pieces which you can find in the archives. And then there were people who I found in the Nehru Memorial Library who'd also written their memories of the time and bits and pieces like that. So, you kind of like put it all together and you create a picture. Also, I find that, I mean, this is the book. And I think his photograph is quite a strong, can you see it?
Yes, absolutely.
And I mean, that's, even his photograph speaks a lot. Do you know what I mean? It's quite a strong, determined sort of person. And there is what he actually said in the court at the time. You know, he was sort of all alone, but he didn't flinch. So all those things are there. And even his father, you know, tried to write his life story. And there was a kind of, on the one hand, there was a rejection maybe for what he did and the implications of it, but there was a certain kind of respect for him, for his determination, his, you know, all that kind of thing, and the fact that he just believed in something, even if they felt that it was not, you know, and went to the end of his beliefs, and that's there. It took a lot of courage. It took a lot of courage, and what was interesting was also in the journey of finding out who were the people who remembered and who were the people who didn't remember. Do you know what I mean? The Bengalis remembered. In the Punjab, it was the Sikhs who remembered. And that was interesting. Then, if you think about it, you know, Bhagat Singh was a Sikh, Udham Singh was a Sikh. So therefore, they remembered them all, and both of them had been inspired by Madan Lal, who was a Punjabi. You see what I mean? So just as much as he was forgotten, he also wasn't forgotten. So that's how it was. And I suppose for me, it was a hidden story like my hidden story. But I didn't know why I wanted to find it out. I wanted to find it out for me. But did I want to find it out and put it out into the world? That's been the difficult part of the journey.
Right.
Of actually
So
putting it out in the world. And it's kind of like frightening a little bit.
Mm-hmm. He was an extremely young man when he was executed. I
25.
think just 25 years old. So did he leave any notes at all? I don't know, because your book sometimes moves between, because you're trying to recreate that period. And that's where I feel it was helpful that you grew up in London, because many of the things that you describe would have been perhaps experiences when you put in dialogue, when you put in that move between fact and a bit of fiction of what his life would have been like. You're able to identify with it, which is quite fascinating, really, that transition. But did you find anything written by him about his, because you mentioned a notebook, but there was nothing apart from his final statement in court? No?
No, that's in the archive. That's in the trial deposition.
Mm-hmm.
The things that she said, and it's Scotland Yard or other people were saying we're at this meeting and this is what he said. And he didn't seem to say an awful lot.
Okay.
You know, so it's other people saying what the doctor said about him, what other people say about him. You know, that was there. And then there are certain mysterious things which happen in the process of writing, where voices come or images come, and you don't quite know where they come from. But the fact that they have come when you're sitting down and doing something, you go into it, and then it sort of takes over a little bit.
Right.
I don't know whether you found that.
Of course, I think we all tend to channel the people that we are writing about, especially if it is a biography. And you're quite right. It's quite magical sometimes when you're thinking of something and you actually read that something very close to it had happened in that very precise way. So I'm sure some of what we would think are imaginary conversations may have actually taken place. And as an actress, you would already be used to immersing yourself in the figures characters that you're playing. But I think for the listeners and viewers who don't exactly know too much about that period, one of the very important things you bring out is the whole importance of India House. Not India House as we know it today, which is where you go and get your visa and where the High Commissioner comes. No, this was a very different kind of India House, which was revolutionary, full of revolutionaries. And I loved that scene where Madame Kama is there and all that. Now, probably that was, I wanted to ask you, was that entirely made up? Or was there something that you based it on?
No, because other people, there was the Indian Sociologist, which was published, so you could look through and see what events take place. Then Heinemann, who opened the India House, and they had the library named after him, he wrote things as well. And there was this woman called Charlotte Despard, and there was a biography thing written of her and her going to India. So you pick up bits and pieces, you get a picture of the people and all that kind of thing, and you sort of put it in. I think I have a moment when Charlotte Despard says to Heinemann how she communicates with Mazzini said such and such a thing, and he looks at her and she said, yes, I communicate with him regularly on my planchette. But that comes from having read her story. So then you just want to put it in as a texture, and you have her saying it to Heinemann as they walk off for the opening of India House. And then the other thing is that it was a time when there was this change was in the air, and all this was happening. And all these people shared platforms, suffragettes, the Egyptian nationalists, the Sinn Féin, the Russians, you all shared these platforms together, and they helped each other. It was the Irish in the customs who would let certain prescribed books through, and little things.
Yes.
Quietly.
Could you talk a bit more about India House? Because that is where, if you want to use the word, if you could say he was encouraged to take the step that he finally did to shoot Curzon Wyllie, or whether and how it was where students were taught the art of a revolution by people like Savarkar. So if you could describe the atmosphere and the sort of activities that went on and where it is, and it is still there now, but it's not called India House yet.
No. It was set up by Shyamji Krishna Verma, who was a very wealthy man, and he set up the Indian Sociologist, and he decided to set up a hostel for Indian students where they could read all these books which were prescribed and learn about the real nature of what was going on in India. And there was another house, there was another kind of organization led by Dadabhai Naoroji, which would also attract also vying for the same clientele of Indian students. And but India House was a little bit more what they would call in those days, in the Congress, there were the moderates and the extremists. And this was leaning towards what was called extremism, which today we'd see as really quite moderate. Do you know what I mean? But in those days, it was considered extremist. And so he set this up, this Indian sociologist, and he was influenced by Herbert Spencer. And so he was also, in a way, appealing to that layer of the British, English, progressive, whatever the kind of people who believed that the whole thing in India was wrong. You see what I mean? Like the socialists, all this kind of thing. So he was appealing to that, and then he said, so to come to England, you'd have to be quite wealthy, get into the universities and this, that, and the other. So he set up these scholarships, and other Indians contributed to these scholarships and these fellowships and these lectureships where people could apply and come. And the people who apply and come were all people who were in some way active towards anti-imperialism. I can't, you can't always find the right words at the right time, but who were, objecting to colonial rule. And they were the people who came, Bipin Chandra Pal or Lajpat Rai from the Punjab, or, and they had these kinds of scholarships. And among them, there was Savarkar, who had a fellowship, and they were all young revolutionaries. So when Bapat was thrown out of wherever it was because he had a badge on, he was sort of taken in, and this man had a lot of money and this, that, and the other. But what happened was that these young people were a bit more extreme than Krishna Varma really wanted things to be. He was very good at talking about it, but he didn't want anything to get out of hand. And things started to get out of hand. And people's questions started to be asked in the house. So he then left and ran away to Paris to be safe, because, he likely to be arrested or whatever it was. So the kinds of things that were happening in India, where it was getting more, were happening here. There were all these divisions taking place. And yes, it was just about all the early revolutionaries who'd been out of India went through India House, be it anti-colonial elements, be it Dayal or Gandhi or I have a thing in which at one point I had the idea of trying to do it first as a kind of a drama documentary. And I had this idea of putting all the plaques of all the people who had been through India House, and there was hardly room for them when I did a mock-up for the amount of people. There was Chattopadhyay, they all have, actually, all these people have an important story which has got lost because they all sacrificed their life in different ways.
Right.
Chattopadhyay was shot by Stalin.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that, of course, is the importance of India House. And just to remind everybody, we're talking about the first decade of the 20th century, the 1900s, really. 1906. And basically a time when there was, in fact, possibly more freedom for revolutionaries in England than there was for them in India. Because out here, like you mentioned, they found a lot of very sympathetic British people who were willing to listen to them and to support their cause and to say, yes, the British should get out of India. So in many ways, even as those say, this is another hidden history that needs to be explored further. In many ways, they were also giving an incentive to those who were freedom fighters back in India, that here we are with you. And this is where I think Savarkar was able to encourage people like Madan Lal Dhingra, who had a passion but didn't really know what he was going to do with it, encourage him to shoot or to kill someone.
Well, he was inculcated with the whole cult of Mazzini. Mm-hmm. And Mazzini had this whole thing of targeted assassinations.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And that, these were, all these things have their vocabulary. Do you know what I mean? It's almost like a vocabulary of, and 1905, 1906, 7, this was the time in Russia where you had the Narodniks. It was, it's, as I said, this was and also there was this big thing which had happened about, yes, it was that time. And it was very interesting in a way to read about it. And then you get into the kind of fervor of it and the whole thing of it.
Excitement of it. I think that is where, as you said, Madan Lal comes to England as a student. He comes from a family that supports the British. And yet once he comes to India House, what is it, 39 Cromwell Street? What is the address exactly? Something like that. I've been to it. But he comes there and then he decides that this is the stance he's going to take, that he's going to assassinate someone.
I think that
So
Madan Lal,
how did you come to the understanding? Why did this quiet man who hardly had anything to say decide to become an assassin?
well, I think it was an older story. I think that there were many things that happened in his experience from the things that I read, which made him very opposed to the whole thing. Like he ran away from home, he went out to sea, he tried to go to Australia. I mean, and all the way along, the fact that he was a brown person came in the way. You know, that was his experience. His father sent him to work in the settlement department, and he sort of thought, what is this settlement department? So he already was out of kilter because he'd already had a different experience from everybody else. And he was sent to England to sort of ground him. But it went a different way.
Right.
Yeah.
Leena, do you want to do a reading at this moment? Because we have just
read. Would you like me to read about me in Paris or Madan Lal?
I think Madan Lal, because we are now talking about him. So I think let's get a sense of how you describe him. Yes.
So this is when his brother, Madan Lal, arrives in London. And he goes to fetch him. And when he'd arrived in London, his elder brother had taken him around the city. So he says, "I'll take you for a walk around London today," said Madan. Madan was delighted. "Okay, I'm ready. Kundan Bhai told us about your walk." "Really? But there's another London." "Oh, will you show that to me as well?" Later, as they were walking down the street together, Madan burst forth, "Oh, Bhajan, you can't imagine how exciting it is. Everything is changing, the entire world order, and we're part of it. We're living in this most exciting time. When I came here, I walked everywhere, searching for something I needed to understand." "Like what?" "I don't know, it changed. At first, I wanted to understand their power, what it was, where it came from. Then I wanted to know who I was and where I fitted into things." They arrived at Westminster Bridge. Bhajan beamed a smile of recognition. "This is it, isn't it?" "What?" Bhajan was lost in his thoughts. "Is this earth has not anything to show so fair?" Bhajan was laughing. Madan was laughing. "When I first came here, I thought, when Bhajan comes, he's sure to recite Wordsworth." They admired the view. "But you see," continued Madan, "I have also learned that in that beautiful building over there, they make decisions and pass laws that humiliate, oppress, and rob us. I have been inside and have heard them. And in any case, who is to say there's nothing as fair as Westminster Bridge? What else has he seen? Has he ever been to the Himalayas?" Bhajan was also laughing. "It's a poem, Madan Bhai. He's describing a feeling." "Well, I'm also describing a feeling. The world hath not seen anything so unjust, that these descendants of pirates and buccaneers, now so puffed up with self-conceit from strutting around the globe, looting and pillaging, drugging and destroying, and doing what they like by virtue of their superior might and weapons of destruction. What as simple as that, isn't it? 30 million pounds are taken out of India every year, and the return is famine and plague. What a sorry plight we have been reduced to. And they can stand up in that house of theirs and declare that all the literatures of Arabia and Asia are worth less than a single shelf of good European books. Well, we read that shelf and more, whereas they probably haven't read anything. What about Sir Edwin Arnold? I mean, his song Celestial is a beautiful rendering of the Bhagavad Gita. You used to like it. We read our texts in their translations. Look at us, Bhajan. Are we not fine examples of Macaulay's minute? What is it he said? Madan assumed a mock pompous Victorian stance. A class of Indians, a class of persons, Indian in blood and colour, but English in taste, opinions, morals, and intellect. Imagine. We can eat with a knife and fork, play cricket, dance, recite Wordsworth, but what you'll soon find out is that however cultured, refined, and capable we may be, all they see is colour. Coolies. And this conceit of colour they call culture, the audacity. We were a great civilization when they were running around in bearskins. Do you understand what I'm saying? Of course. I'm listening.
Right,
So
very good. Excellent. I think it gives a very good sense, even though it is a conversation, which obviously you would have imagined, but it gives a good sense of his growing frustration, how he would have possibly looked at the British, because there has to be a build-up before he takes a gun and shoots at Curzon Wyllie. Now, do you want to just explain a little bit, just very briefly, because we do want people to read the book, so I don't want to give away everything. And this is, as you said, the mystery for them will be all these moments which you have put together and how you have successfully recreated what very few people probably had thought about, the build up to the assassination.
well, one of the things that I found out in my
Mhm.
process of my research is that the British also had this idea that basically Indians were cowards,
Mhm.
and that's who, and this kind of they lacked backbone and manliness, and well, they were cowards. So, in a way, there's a whole way in which you imbibe the agenda, and then you're trying to act in relation to that agenda. So that agenda of these young revolutionaries everywhere at that time was this thing of showing we are not cowards, we are. And the interesting thing is that after this assassination and this thing, all these people like Lloyd George and Winston Churchill and all these people had tremendous admiration for Madan Lal because, in a way, he was talking that vocabulary. So it's like all the time we imbibe a certain thing and then we're not really being ourselves. We're talking to what we've been. Do you see what I mean? Or am I not being clear?
No, you are. Yes, yes. No, totally.
It's
Because I think
very important to show that we are not cowards. We are
to
whatever.
change the perception. So, which is what he was in his own way trying to do. But it was a very brutal execution because he was by himself. He's away from home. He really has nobody with him, and then he has to put on a very brave stance. But in your book, you make it sound as though he was just able to go through it almost peacefully. And I think one of the jailers or somebody did make such a comment that he saw him and he was very calm before his execution. That was really amazing.
No, those reports were. I don't know if it was before his execution. That was when he was arrested,
Okay. Mm-hmm.
and his pulse didn't go up. Well, he had he had convinced himself that what he was doing was for the greater good of his countrymen, of India. Do you see what I mean? So that's the whole thing, isn't it? When it's like the big saver, the big. He was. That's where he was there.
Mm-hmm. But for a
But
very young man to be able to think like that is quite remarkable, So he obviously, in some ways, was able to show the strength of character. He did not plead for mercy. He did not say,
no,
"Let me off at any moment." So let's move on then, because we just have a little bit time left now, onto the very, very unusual thing that happens to him afterwards, after he dies, the entire process of the exhumation. Could you shed a light on that?
Well, I heard that this exhumation was that they had found that these bodies, the 70s exhumations, 2 people were exhumed, Udham Singh and Madan Lal. And they found that, I was told that the body had remained preserved and that the lime scale had made a cocoon. And this can happen, but you don't normally open coffins and things to have a look. And that became like a kind of a metaphor of waiting for the time when he was going to be exhumed and returned to the homeland where he came from, and to the Punjab, and to the landscape that he was part of. Eventually I did, and then I couldn't get this information then, but the actual document that I found in the archives, that felt very strange. It said, license for the removal of human remains. Then it says Madan Lal Dhingra, and on that it says that this mustn't be talked about or reported or made known. So there are all these layers all along of silencing of things. So there's my internal silencing, the partition is never talked about. I mean, I could read one little thing about how it reflected on me, this kind of, shall I do that? Very, very quick.
Why not? I think that's a very good idea.
Time. And
Yes.
this is my mother when she says, she always talks about this. She's trying to build a house in India. She always talks about this house that she built in Lahore. And right till the end, she's talking about this life of Lahore. That for her was what was lost. So she has, I don't know how much time I have.
No, we have about, I think, at least 7 minutes.
She's stretched out on the big bed, covered in paisley shawl, in her purple sari with a yellow border. My mother would enunciate, in life, you have to have a dream, and then you have to dream it. From the time I was quite small, I had this dream of building a house to my design. Everyone laughed at me, and I let them laugh. They laughed. I dreamed, and I built my house. I was the first person in my family to build a house, and we would have parties, dancing parties, fancy dress parties, literary parties. Once I went as Helen of Troy, and your father was Marlowe. Was this the face that launched 1,000 ships? It was a wonderful life. Or sometimes she might look wistfully out of the window and ask the grey Parisian sky, why did these Britishers always make these partitions, huh? Creating endless suffering? Tell me, why? The sky had no reply. As a small child, I never quite knew what partition was. Was it a mighty machine or a mean monster? I only knew that it was something bad, that it had hurt my darling mummy and daddy, and it upset them to talk about it. And I didn't want to upset them. I loved them too much for that. I wanted to help them. And for that, I needed to be a good girl, do as I was told, and not ask too many questions. Both my parents were storytellers, but partition was never a story that could be told. And my attempt to clarify what it was only led to more confusion. Lahore was our home. We couldn't go back to Lahore because it was no longer in India but in Pakistan, which was a Muslim state, and we were Hindus. And no, of course, it didn't mean that Muslims were our enemies. Where did I get such a silly, idiotic idea? After all, Uncle Bashir and Auntie Sarah and Uncle Aziz and Nazim and Auntie this and Auntie that, they were all Muslims. Indian Muslims were our friends, and yes, and so were some Pakistani Muslims, though sometimes they weren't always allowed to be because the governments didn't want them to be. So that is why my father and Uncle Akhtar never met in Paris. We would drive out instead in separate cars to Jean's place in the countryside. This was because even though Uncle Akhtar was a good friend and had been my father's student in Lahore, and the families had known each other for generations, Uncle Akhtar now worked in the Pakistani embassy, and we were Indians. Yes, that's right. Uncle Akhtar had been an Indian before partition, but now he was Pakistani, although he had a brother who was still an Indian because he'd stayed on in India. And no, we couldn't go to Lahore because it was in Pakistan. And these conversations usually end by my being told it was rude to ask so many questions. and to remember that although we had lost everything and were refugees, we must be very grateful and always remember to share our good fortune.
Wonderful. And it is so ironical that we are having this conversation. You're reading these portions, and from your book, which deal with partition. And tomorrow, of course, is the 17th of August, which was the day the Radcliffe Award was actually announced. And at our museum,
And
we
also,
had.
also, it is the day of the execution. So
Amazing.
it's central.
It's so ironical, isn't it?
Central in his story because that's the day he's executed. And it's central in my story because that's the day suddenly my parents learn in a hotel room in Paris that there's nowhere for them to go back to.
Exactly. And ironically, again, enough, as I said, in at our museum, this is commemorated every year as Partition Remembrance Day. But of course, now the Indian government has recently announced 14th of August.
But it should be the 17th.
We can debate that, but I was just talking about how wonderfully appropriate it is for us to be discussing this, including Madan Lal's execution, which therefore then becomes a symbol of partition in a manner of speaking.
Yes.
And what is also amazing is that he himself and his family, till you decided to take, he himself never tried to act like this patriot before he died. He did everything very quietly. And even your family has never really talked about this till you came along and decided to do that. Why was that?
As I said, I don't really know. I think it was partly to do with I was haunted by the story. And I think it was partly to do that I was in London. And I used to sometimes think, this little girl in India said, you must find out about Madan Lal. You'd have to go to London for that, because that's where Madan Lal was. And then I was in London. And I'd sometimes wonder where he was and where he had been. And then suddenly I found out that not only was Highgate just across from where I lived and I could see it, I found out that my grandfather died 5 minutes walk from my house.
Amazing.
So suddenly I was connected, just even in that locality, to my forebears. And then I found a little photograph, which was my grandfather died in London, and he was cremated at the Golders Green crematorium. Oh, nice. And there are all this Sikh ceremony, and all these sardars are there with their turbans. And I looked at this for a long time, and I said, "What's this?" And I said, "Oh my God, that's the Golders Green crematorium." And there's a tiny little photograph. And then I sort of realized, oh, he was also cremated there. Do you know what I mean? So, yes, so it's also got to do with being in London.
Right.
And in a way, London was, in the end, the nearest thing that I ever experienced to some kind of stability.
Right. Well, I think we are almost out of time now, and therefore I'm going to hold up a copy of your book and ask all the viewers to read it and to learn about the hidden history of Madan Lal Dhingra that has been so beautifully and very evocatively brought out, by Leena. And before we actually leave, I'm sure Tia will come along at some stage and say, okay, now time's up. Could you quickly tell us about what you're writing next?
Well, I suppose it is to an extent about my mother, but I'm not quite sure whether it is. It just sort of starts in London. It's called, yes, well, I'm thinking of calling it A House in Hampstead.
There you are.
Okay. There is this thing. When I moved here, I was sitting down to write, and I had this voice which came in, my mother's voice. Never in my wildest dreams did I ever imagine that I would ever leave Lahore. And then I realized that for 50 years she'd lived in this house, and we'd all lived there, and we'd never left Lahore. Here we were in this tall townhouse in London, and nobody ever left Lahore.
Right. Amazing. Well, I don't know, Tia, are we out of time? Is she going to come back and tell us? Like the warlord or somebody? Yep, that's it, she says. So thank you so much, Leena. It was so wonderful to talk to you.
Thank you, Kishwar.
And to learn about your book.
Yes, and thank you for all the lovely things you've said about the book.
And good luck. And tomorrow is the book launch.
It'll be in the bookshops. It can also be ordered from HopeRoad and from bookshop.org.
Lovely. Thank you so much. Good luck with the launch.
Thank you.